On the morning of January 7th, 2005, a man named Uro found himself in a situation that would lead to his tragic and untimely death. A man in his 30s had been picked up by the police while heavily intoxicated and taken to a police station in Dessau, Germany, under a false pretext. At first glance, it seemed like another routine arrest, but the events that followed were anything but routine. Uro was placed in a holding cell, cell number 5, where he would remain for hours, his fate sealed in ways no one could have predicted. What happened in that cell, however, has remained shrouded in confusion, contradictions, and an overwhelming amount of missing evidence. Initially, the authorities claimed that Uro had set himself on fire in the cell, but as investigators dug deeper, this explanation became increasingly hard to believe. Something didn't add up. Forensic experts, after thoroughly examining the scene, concluded that Uro could not have started the fire by himself. What's more, it became clear that he had likely been unconscious before the fire even broke out. How could he have set himself on fire if he was incapacitated? Further investigations into Uro's injuries told a disturbing story. The initial autopsy had found no significant injuries, but when a team of researchers revisited the case years later, using advanced technology to re-examine old CT scans, they discovered multiple severe injuries. A broken nasal bone, a fractured skull, a ruptured nasal septum, and a broken rib. Each one of these injuries pointed to one undeniable conclusion. Uro had been physically assaulted before the fire started. This wasn't an accident or a suicide attempt. It was a case of premeditated violence. As the forensic evidence mounted, a pattern began to emerge, suggesting that Uro's injuries and subsequent death were part of something far darker. The team at Forensic Architecture, a British research group, reconstructed the smoke patterns in the cell and found something that raised eyebrows. According to their analysis, the cell door must have been opened during the fire, contradicting the official account that Uro had set himself on fire alone. There was more. The police had claimed that a lighter found at the scene was the instrument used to ignite the flames. But when investigators scoured the scene, no lighter was found. It only surfaced 3 days later when a bag of debris was re-examined, and by then, it was clear that it had been tampered with. The lighter was melted beyond recognition, and fire experts pointed out that it would have exploded had it been exposed to such intense heat. Even more strangely, red fibers were fused into the plastic of the lighter, fibers that didn't match anything in the cell. If the lighter had been at the scene of the fire, those fibers should have come from something in the immediate area, but they didn't. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the case was the lack of proper documentation. The crime scene investigation was supposed to be meticulously recorded on video by a police officer named Jens W. But the footage abruptly cut off after just 4 minutes. Jens claimed that a power outage had caused the interruption, but no one else was able to corroborate his story. The camera had a working battery, and witnesses later disputed his claim. Even more bizarre was the fact that shortly after the video stopped recording, Jens went on sick leave for 2 months, supposedly due to an allergy. Meanwhile, key pieces of evidence mysteriously disappeared. Files related to Uro's case were deleted from police computers, including backups. Logs of the people present at the station on the morning of the incident vanished. Photographs taken by officers that day disappeared without a trace. Surveillance footage from the station hallway was also nowhere to be found. With each new revelation, the official narrative that Uro had set himself on fire became more and more implausible. It was clear that there was a concerted effort to cover up the truth. Almost every expert who examined the case agreed Uro could not have set himself on fire on his own. Someone else must have been responsible. But the question remained, who would want to harm Uro so brutally, and why? As the investigation continued, a chilling theory began to take shape. It seemed increasingly likely that Uro had been assaulted by the officers who were supposed to be protecting him. He had been intoxicated and defenseless, and in his vulnerable state, he had likely been beaten within an inch of his life. At some point, someone, perhaps an officer or multiple officers, poured accelerant on him and set him on fire. But who were these people and what was their motivation? The key officers involved in Uro's arrest and detention came under scrutiny. Shift supervisor Andreas S. was one of the first to be questioned. According to testimony, He had ignored the fire alarm not once but twice. 11 long minutes passed between the first alarm and his eventual decision to check on Uro. But Andreas's whereabouts were dubious. Some reports claimed he was in the control room on the second floor at the time, which raised questions about what he actually knew and when he knew it. His behavior was suspicious, and it seemed he was trying to cover something up. Beata H., another officer, initially implicated Andreas in the incident, but her testimony changed over time. After meeting with Andreas and his lawyers, Beata recanted her earlier statement. She claimed to have heard Uro's cries for help over the intercom during the fire, although it's likely that by then Uro was already unconscious. Her shifting story suggested that she knew more than she was letting on, but her loyalty to the officers she worked with may have prevented her from speaking out. Meanwhile, Hans M. and Udo S., two other officers involved in Uro's detention, also faced scrutiny. Hans M. had arrested Uro and placed him in cell number 5, but he insisted that he was out on patrol during the fire. Witnesses, however, reported seeing him near the scene, which cast doubt on his alibi. Udo S. had a particularly troubling background. He had previously worked as a firefighter specializing in pyrotechnics, and experts speculated that he might have known exactly how to start a fire with the intensity needed to cover up the crime. But no one ever investigated this lead further, and no charges were brought against him. A strange figure, referred to only as another man with glasses, was reportedly seen in the police station during the fire. An officer recalled walking past someone in the stairwell just as the fire brigade arrived, and this individual appeared to be watching the scene from the control room window. Who was this man, and what was his role in all of this? In the days following the fire, an informant reached out to a journalist with a startling claim. He revealed that he knew who was responsible for Uro's death. According to the informant, the perpetrator entered the station's custody area through a back door, a door secured by a code known only to police officers. The informant suggested that the motive behind the crime was rooted in racism and sexual humiliation. He claimed that someone wanted to teach Uro a lesson and had gone too far. This claim mirrored earlier reports of a troubling culture within the police station, a culture that included regular abuse of intoxicated individuals. In fact, some officers had openly admitted that it was common practice to arrest and detain drunk people to teach them a lesson. According to one officer, it was a tradition carried over from the GDR era, tying unruly individuals to the pillars in the canteen and beating them as a form of punishment. The more the investigation unfolded, the more it seemed that Uro's death was not an isolated incident. Two similar cases had occurred at the same station in the past. In 1997, a man named Ans Uran Rosa was found dead after being severely beaten while in police custody. In 2002, another man named Mario Bachon died under similar circumstances with a fractured skull. Despite the obvious signs of police brutality in these cases, no one was ever held accountable. Was Uro's death part of a broader pattern of abuse at the station? Could his race have played a role in his brutal treatment? In court, officers had been heard referring to Uro as the Black African instead of using his name. This troubling detail added a racial dimension to the case that couldn't be ignored. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to foul play, the authorities continued to maintain the official narrative that Uro had set himself on fire. But when prosecutor Volker Bittman began investigating the case in 2013, he quickly realized that the theory of self-immolation couldn't explain the fire. Expert fire experiments failed to replicate the conditions of the cell fire, and a panel of experts concluded that it was scientifically impossible for Uro to have set the fire on his own. But just as it seemed that justice might finally be within reach, Bittman was removed from the case, and the investigation was handed over to another prosecutor's office, which promptly closed it, citing insufficient evidence. The case was effectively shut down. But Uro's family refused to let the truth die. They continued to fight for justice, appealing to the European Court of Human Rights in 2023. Uro's story has become a symbol of the ongoing struggle for accountability in cases of police violence and systemic racism. In 2020, two journalists visited Udo S., his home, to ask about his involvement in the case. Despite the mounting evidence against him, he repeatedly denied any wrongdoing. "I'm at peace with myself," he said, "and I didn't do anything." But Uro's family and supporters are determined to keep pushing for justice, no matter how long it takes. The fight for the truth presses on, and Uro's legacy lives on in the ongoing battle for accountability.